Welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover stance-based characters in fighting games and how to make them more accessible to newcomers. However, before we get into the video, are you familiar with this character archetype and do you play any? For those not in the know, stance characters are some of the most technical to play in fighting games because of their very nature. But what are stance characters? They're a character that changes their moveset based off positioning. Some obvious examples of stance-based characters are Tira and Voldo from Soul Calibur, Helena Douglas from DOA, Vanessa and Mei Li from the King of Fighters, and Hwoarang from Tekken. Now that we know some of the more obvious examples of stance characters, why are we talking about them? Well, remember when I said moments ago they're some of the most technical characters you can play in their respective games? This greatly reduces their accessibility to newcomers. Now admittedly, it's generally not a good idea for a newbie to play this type of character. However, that doesn't mean developers shouldn't look into ways in which they can make this archetype easier to play, since stance characters are still going to be some of the hardest move lists to learn in all of fighting games. In this video, I'm going to explore how devs could improve the accessibility factor of these characters. Macros have been a long-time staple in fighting games. In Soul Calibur, the main macro I can think of off the top of my head is tied to using the Soul Gauge, which controls the properties of Soul Charge and Critical Edge. For Soul Charge, the properties of characters' moves change, which in and of itself could be considered a stance, and grants them access to new moves. Critical Edge, on the other hand, is the character's super move. These are all tied to the R2 button. In the case of Helena in Dead or Alive, you merely need to press L1 and back. Taking this philosophy of easy inputs is definitely a good idea, however, it could be made simpler. This would eliminate one of the problems, and yet the archetype would still be hard to play because they'd require the player to know when to use which stance, and have knowledge of the properties of the moves in those stances, on top of knowing the moves of the opponent's characters as well. Admittedly, this complexity is mostly thanks to companies like SNK that love complicated inputs. However, adding the complexity of stance characters is requiring either very precise inputs via strict timing, or via hard inputs to do. This will put a lot of players off the character that may otherwise suit their playstyle. For example, I was incredibly intimidated by trying out Vanessa from KOF simply because she's known to be one of the most complicated characters in that franchise. But once I actually tried her, I was able to figure out some of her bread and butter moves. Figuring her stances out is still a struggle for me, and I'm not a great player, but fuck it, I'm having fun. Roster diversity is one of the defining things one needs to consider with fighting games. This lack of diversity is part of why I was unable to get as invested into Guilty Gear as I wanted to. Once I found 3 characters I liked, I was able to start having a lot of fun with the game, but the smaller character roster meant my point of entry was severely hampered, and I wasn't having as much fun as I could have. If developers made stance characters more accessible, either with very simple controls to access the stances or with macros, then it'd open up a whole new realm of possibilities for developers. They could offer things like beginner and intermediate friendly stance characters who'd have one simple stance to pull off with an extensive move list, or they could have a moderately difficult input to access a stance and then have a shorter move list to compensate. With this entry, I'm specifically calling out the King of Fighters. Mei Li is one of my favorite characters in fighting game history. Her rekkas are just super fun to play with. Her superhero mode is also fun to use if you can access it. However, she was never a hugely popular character in the King of Fighters because her stances were hard to pull off, meaning only the most dedicated of players were going to bother learning her. Her last appearance in a mainline KOF title was in 2002. Chances of her making future KOF rosters are slim to none. but just a simple change in how stances work would actually make her somewhat accessible for those who might be interested in playing her. What are your thoughts on stance characters though? Do you think they need any tweaks? Let me know in the comments. Also, if you play stance characters, who's your favorite one to play? If you want to keep up with me on social media, links for that will be in the description. Also, if you want to check out more of my content, 2 of my videos will be popping up on screen now. One YouTube thinks you'll like, and the other is on why auto combos are necessary in modern fighting games. Until next time, keep blazing that trail.